Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Sweet Spot Safari number 90. And today's topic is on mind and matter. And we're really lucky to have Stephanie Laing with us, who is our guest explorer. We'll let her explain her background and her interests in a bit more detail in a minute. But she's got a really interesting background in that she has worked in the business life, but then moved on to community and charities. She's also now got very much strong charity interests and involvement. And she's also been a TEDx speaker as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Steph. And as always, our rationale here is to go through a subject and basically explore patterns and polarities and see if we can find some sweet spots in the middle. And hopefully then, trigger a few thought processes with people as we go along. So over to you, Stephanie.
Hello, I'm Steph. Lovely to be here. So I have done various things in my life. So I am a stand-up comedian. I've been doing that for most of my adult life. So since I was 20, and I'm 21, so I'm 38 now. So long time, 17 years, being a funny lady. I used to work in executive education. So I was running training courses for big businesses in the European office of Duke Corporate Education. And then in lockdown in 2020, all of my comedy work went out the window, and I didn't want to do stand-up online. There were a lot of Zoom comedy shows which I felt would make my soul die, so I didn't do them. I did one where I pre-recorded myself on my laptop and sent them a video, and I was like, I know, I wish I was dead. And then a job came up where I was living in Milton Keynes to work as a community organizer, and I had done a master's in community organizing a few years previously and been volunteering in that area for a while. So I applied for that job because I wanted to make myself useful, and ran the Milton Keynes branch of that charity for about 2.5 years. So we were running campaigns to make real change on social justice issues. So we were working on things like climate change, street safety, misogyny, fair wages, refugees welcome, just trying to make the world a fairer place, but working with, not for. So it's very sort of bottom up, not top down. So strengthening civil society, working with civil society institutions, schools, universities, faith groups, trade union branches, bringing together so many people who you might not think have a lot in common, but actually everybody wants the same stuff, really. We want to be paid fairly. We want to get a good education. We want our kids to be safe. And so I did that for a long time, and then I moved up to Lincolnshire because I fell in love, and then tried to run that charity remotely, but got very sleepy. And so now I run a charity with my partner, who you've had on the show before, called the Serendipity Foundation, supporting people into work who might otherwise be undervalued in or underrepresented in the job market. So people with learning disabilities, ex-offenders, single parents often as well, just connecting them up with employers and supporting them once they're in the workplace as well. So yeah, that's what I'm doing now. And I'm a dancer at the moment as well. Thank you, the Arts Council, for giving me some money to shake my bits around.
Yes, wonderful. And wow. And what an interesting career. And guess what? My first faux pas was I forgot to mention the fact that you were a comedian, right? Which of course is what you've been doing for the last 17 years, the largest part of your working career. So so then I'll take that one as a hit on my side. Right, wonderful. So we'll go and start the process as we always do with an opening question. So I think and this is sort of a stacked question, but one is, how do you think, firstly, we would define mind and matter? Because it's always good to get people's different perspectives because it's such a wide topic. And then the sort of follow-on secondary question would be, what do you think, if at all, the power of knowing the differences? And maybe putting that into your own context, and we can go and explore that. Okay.
Okay. So I've been thinking about this a lot recently from like a spiritual belief standpoint. I was very briefly Christian when I was about 12. Come from an atheist family. I was very briefly Christian. I used to go to church by myself, and I sat at the back with this old lady who used to tell me I had a space saved for me in heaven because I came to church by myself. And I used to go to the youth club afterwards. And my friend asked me one day, I was like, I'm not sure if I'm a Christian. She was like, do you believe that Jesus saves? And I was like, I'm not sure he was even a guy. I don't know if he existed. So I stopped going to church. So I was like, whoopsie, that's the fundamental thing to be a Christian. So I think since then I've been trying to work out what I believe. And I think, so I used to work with so many religious people when I was a community organizer. You work with so many faith groups. And you have a huge part of the job is having really meaningful conversations with everybody. You're supposed to have 3 meaningful conversations every day. Like as a professional community organizer, you have to sit down for at least 45 minutes with 3 different people and get to know what motivates them, what their origin story is, what makes them angry, what they want to change. And so often I'd be sitting down with like a vicar or a priest or an imam or all these faith leaders and very religious people. And what I realized actually is that people believe a lot of the same stuff. And people are basically talking about the same thing when they use words like God, Allah, Vishnu, universal consciousness, love, just like consciousness in general. And I believe in the thing that people are talking about when they use those words. It's just we're all using different words for it. So for me, mind would be partly the universal consciousness which connects us all in my belief system, and then my little sort of node of that. Like I feel like we're all like little nodules that connect up the universal consciousness. I'm going immediately quite deep, sorry.
No, that's great.
And so for me, mind, and I feel like matter is my body. That's where I live, and it's like the perfect little nest for my bit of the universal consciousness to live in. And it's good transport, it keeps my brain healthy, it's somewhere for it to live so that I can experience the world. And for me, the purpose of that process and the purpose of being alive is to be aware of what's going on. I feel like you have to pay attention. I think of it as like attention and intention. Like you have to pay attention to what's going on. Like that's why we're here, and you have to do stuff. Like that's what separates conscious things from just matter. Like we intentionally do stuff that doesn't make sense in the general laws of physics. Like the laws of physics don't justify the fact that I'm moving my arm about right now. It's my consciousness that's making that happen, and that's really powerful. I think that intention and attention. So I think matter is kind of the tool that means that you can use your mind to do cool stuff. And I think that that's our kind of responsibility as humans. Like I think we're humans for a reason. Yeah. Initial thought, Steph.
That's wonderful. That was very in-depth.
Right in the deep end.
Definition, absolutely in the deep end. And I loved your analogy about the mind being the universal connecting us, and you were just a little node or nodule in this. I think that really puts things into perspective. And I know that's one of the things that we've explored before, the power of nuance and perspective. Everything is contextual, right? Although we have literal things, as you described, which you could argue is the matter, right? Or not, as you may want to do, because also the word matter is quite interesting as well, because we use it in the context of matter of fact. Does it matter? Is it consequential? Is it inconsequential and stuff like that? So I thought that was really interesting. And I know, Ben, this is something that resonates with you. I was just wondering whether you wanted to come in on this one. So,
yeah, it sounds like I think I've probably been on a similar adjacent journey. Probably my experience of church and religion growing up was probably a little bit more extensive. I went to Catholic school and went to church pretty much every Sunday for a good decade and a bit. I would say. And yeah, I hadn't really had the language. I'm not really an academic type of person, so a lot of what I've learned has really been in adult life, probably in the last 10 years predominantly. And there's something about this exploring and understanding who you are and what this life is all about. I think is something which I've been on journey wise. So yeah, I had this. So looking back, religion was really about this, as you say, this kind of mental or mind world, this kind of this kind of belief system and kind of rituals and stories and myths and things which kind of organize our thoughts and shape our actions. And then I had, and maybe this is just the way that our minds develop and how we develop. I then had this impulse to be more kind of scientific. I didn't really call it that when I got into my 20s, but focusing on things which I can see and measure and know and quantify, and life then becomes this career about kind of numbers and achievements and knowledge and kind of a bit more certainty. And then I guess I just got to a point and was like, well, it's not really. There's something more. There's something more. There's something more, and there's something which this doesn't really explain. So science is very good at telling us, what is something, but it doesn't really kind of and predicting how things work, but understanding why they work and how we should live and what choices we should make. I don't know. There was something missing there. So I really resonate with this, and the kind of mind and matter relationship I think is just really really kind of interesting. And I just wonder, actually, do you sense, speaking doing the work which you're doing, do you sense that actually we're in this moment where we're kind of looking for more kind of spiritual kind of connections? We're kind of yearning for something which is a little bit unexplainable, and do you kind of sense this in our culture that actually we're kind of moving to exploring what this means in the 21st century?
I do get that sense. It might be because of my TikTok algorithm. But I think that times are very, very hard at the moment in a lot of ways. And it makes sense that in that situation, people would search for meaning a lot more. If things are horrible, you're like, why is this happening? Why am I even alive? What's the point? Everything's rubbish. And I also feel like the climate crisis makes people, it is encouraging a lot of people to think more about their personal connection to the earth, which I think is a sort of interesting mix of mind and matter, because it's the physical world that supports us and means that we can be alive. But also it feels like a very spiritual connection when you think like, this is this tiny little haven that we can survive in, and we can't really survive anywhere else at the moment. And I think, when I was talking about like people using different words for like Allah and God and stuff, a lot of people talk about like Gaia or Mother Nature or that kind of thing. I feel like there's kind of, people have more of a need to feel connected to the planet and to feel protective of it as well.
So I'd like to go back on this concept of meaning and sort of follow through the thread a bit, but sort of put a slightly different perspective on it. Because it was quite interesting because, Ben alluded to meaning, which again is a perspective to a certain extent. It's context as well, isn't it? You described physics describing the what, and to a certain extent the how, where the why, science doesn't necessarily explain the why. It can do in certain contexts. But I think this is quite interesting because that the way we've just been describing it a bit is potentially there is a fuzzy border between mind and matter. So if I go back to the original question, where it said, what's the power of knowing the difference? And I'm just wondering whether, because people are struggling with knowing the way, the journey at the moment of finding meaning, whether in a sort of paradoxical or perverse way, understanding a harder boundary or the differences, it might actually help them learn. And I'll explain my thinking around that is that, Ben is heavily into neurodiversity and understanding the brain, of course. And traditionally, we've talked about the left brain and the right brain, whereby, one is around emotion and connection, the other one about is logic and processing, right? And then, of course, neuroscientists are now saying that doesn't really exist, to me, the brain is structured in a different way. But actually, that's a very helpful sort of analogy, metaphor for people to try and understand. And my question is, around, and this is why I asked about the power of knowing the difference, is that if we could actually discuss it, debate it, and understand that there is a difference, whether it's fuzzy or not, that might help people with understanding more meaning, because, we see a lot of political problems in the world, right, where issues are being conflated, right? And actually, sometimes segregation, and I meant here segregation of ideas, right, and issues, might just help people understand, and it might help us come back together in it's like we're on a journey. It's a bit like a hysteresis or a sine wave, right, where it comes apart, or the understanding comes apart, and we come back together again, but we come back together again with greater understanding and meaning. Does that make sense, Steph?
Yeah, I think so. So what's the question?
Well, the question really is, and I don't want to answer my own question. The question is, right, do you think there is a power of knowing the differences and understanding the differences? Because there's a movement going on at the moment. There's also the free speech movement at the moment. We've also got the critical thinking movement. About really understanding data and understanding differences for good reason, for good intent, right? You talked about intention, attention. So I guess, and maybe there isn't, but basically what I'm trying to understand is that, is there, rather than just accepting what it is, right, at face value, right, which is arguably easy, and some people might say even intellectually lazy, and I don't want to judge, but by actually understanding a difference and having a boundary in this case, that will actually help people, And if you think about the early philosophers and the early scientists, that's what they tried to do, didn't they? Try to find meaning, didn't they, by doing exploration and research and experimentation. Does that make a bit more sense now?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. I think one of the ways that I've thought about it before, because I feel like partly I think that it's consciousness that connects us, obviously. So if you can realize that, because science doesn't understand consciousness, first of all, we really don't get what it is. We don't really understand how the brain works. We don't really understand why, that double slit experiment where matter behaves differently when you're looking at it, like, what does that mean? What is my brain? We genuinely scientifically don't understand it. And I think that there's a tendency in science sometimes, previously it feels like anything that couldn't be explained by science was written off as that's just magic, or that's religion. And then the more you understand about the physical scientific world, the more you can classify things, I suppose. And consciousness feels like something that we haven't classified yet. We're just it's just this weird thing that the brain does, but we don't get it. But it's also the thing that unites us. And I think it gives us kind of a responsibility to look after each other. And I think as well that when you think of yourself as like a conscious being that has this brief opportunity to be physically embodied, so it's that separation of I am somehow, and this is obviously again just my belief system, I'm somehow kind of like an eternal conscious thing, and I've got this brief opportunity to be a little embodied human. It's just an amazing opportunity to be maximum human and to be really kind and loving and explorative and have a brilliant time. I think of it as if I was, say, imagine I was from Nicaragua, right? Because I think I'm rambling now. This is my ADHD brain going off on one. I think people have a tendency sometimes to focus so much on spiritual stuff that they don't pay attention to the fact that they're being a human right now. So if I was from Nicaragua and I was an Arctic explorer and I went to the Arctic and I'm there to explore the Arctic, it's the equivalent of spending all my time in the Arctic researching Nicaragua. Like, that's not why I'm here. I'm here to be a human. Like, that's the reason I'm here. So I think acknowledging that difference of, like, I am a physical body with a conscious experience happening means that I pay more attention to what it's like to be here and what it's like to connect with people. Does that make sense?
I think so. And I don't know if this is a helpful way to think about that. I suppose if we just reduce everything down to, you know, our bodies. So we're here and we reduce everything down to matter. Okay, so what we've basically left with is our body does a bunch of different biological processes. Our brain regulates our body, and so the primary purpose is survival. And so what we're kind of reducing basically our existence to is just survival. But we know that actually there's something more there. So then when you add in elements of the mind, you know, however, and I quite like the kind of meaning and purpose piece, you know, because I think that kind of bridges maybe like religious and spiritual with kind of more kind of secular ideas. I think we can all kind of get around the idea of meaning and purpose and kind of growth, and so we kind of know that actually there's something within us which is kind of a little bit intangible, subjective, experiential, which is trying to kind of realize some sort of potential. But actually to realize that potential can't just be stuck in that mental. We actually have to use our body as a vehicle, as an instrument, as a tool, as something to actually realize that meaning and potential and growth. And so then it kind of, you know, survival is necessary because we can't ignore what you're saying is, you know, you can't ignore and actually just always just be in this kind of meaning and purpose and mental phase, because actually your body does need to survive. And so actually just kind of understanding that kind of both of these things are there for a reason, and actually getting stuck in one or the other puts the other in jeopardy. I don't know if that.
No, that makes real sense, because I was just, before you came in there, Ben, that's really helped the situation, is because what Stephanie had just been talking about, Steph, was again intention, attention, right? And it got me thinking again about almost we have to pay attention to our intention as well. And there's this constant, I think, as sometimes the psychologists would say, this rubber banding, right, between one and the two continuously, you know, where we're flipping, you know, it's like probably a short cadence sine wave again, you know, we're constantly looking at these things and moving in and moving out. And again, from a coaching point of view, which is where I work, you know, is that we spend a lot of time moving in to a situation, moving out of a situation, reflecting, and then moving back in and moving back out. So I think there's some real resonance there. So, which I think is fascinating. What I'd like to do is steer us on a slightly different tack for the same topic, if that's okay, and come back to the wonderful work you do in the communities and the charities and everything else. And I think one of the things you'd mentioned previously to us, Steph, was the fact that when you were doing your charity work in Milton Keynes, it was really powerful because there was a lot of consciousness around measuring the output and having tangible outputs, which made a real difference, of course. And that relates to what you've been saying earlier about the importance of being a human. Ultimately, we're all human at the end of the day. So it'd be really interesting if you can just reflect on how, when you were doing that work, how mind and matter played out in that sort of space, you know, either on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. And I know that you said that, you know, one of the objectives was to have at least 3 meaningful conversations a day. You know, how did that play out? Because I think that would really help elucidate it to our listeners in terms of what it really means with a sort of pragmatic example, you know, and one that is out there helping people.
Yeah. So we, I think the work that we did was a really useful way of kind of connecting the two, because we were always connecting with people's self-interest and their belief systems. So, and their sense of injustice. And from asking so many people, what are you angry about? And what do you want to change in the world? What really pisses you off? There's so many things that people are angry about. Quite rightly, there's a lot to be angry about at the moment. And I think sometimes it's easy to slip into a space where all of that is theoretical, and because I think that's partly because of the internet, it's very easy to go on Twitter, do a tweet, or X, whatever it's called now, or like a lot of the right tweets, or be angry at a lot of the right people quietly at home, and to feel like you've contributed to people's material reality in some way. Like, it's so easy to like do activism in this very like at home tick box way, where you just are feeling the correct emotions, but they're not doing anything about it. And that's very frustrating and doesn't really help. And I think contributes to the kind of like the culture war things that we referenced beforehand, where you make sure that you feel like you're on the right team, and that's satisfying for your brain to feel correct. But then in order to make the world better, you have to go out into it. Like, you have to take your physical self outside the door and meet some people and talk to them and find out what they're angry about and see what the intersection is between those two things, and connect with people and be angry together, and then work out what to actually do in the physical actual world. So trying to think of an example of a campaign. So remember your life, Stephanie. So the climate change campaign that we were running, people are very angry about climate change. They are very scared, understandably. And one of the really powerful things about the work that we were doing is that you can get like 10 people in a room together who are all angry and are so frustrated at sitting at home being theoretically angry. And then you bring them into a space and you talk about it properly and work out, do we do this thing called a power analysis, where you work out all of the power associated with the situation. So who has the power to make the change that we want to see? Who are their friends? Who are their colleagues? Who are our allies? What power do we have? And then you pick an issue to work on. So with climate change, it's like a huge thing, and you could be like, our issue that we want to work on is to stop all climate change, but that's not going to happen. So you sliced off an issue. So for instance, we picked that we wanted Thames Valley Police to have a proper non-greenwashing plan to be carbon neutral by 2030. That was just a bit that we could slice off, and that would be the bit that we did. And so we I left the charity, unfortunately, before we got to the point of winning, but we had negotiations with the Police and Crimes Commissioner and with the Chief of Police locally, and there was a chance that we could win and actually affect the world because we took our mind part, which was very caring and loving and angry and full of emotion, and we thought, actually, what can we do in the actual world to use this theoretical stuff to make it legitimately physically better to be here? And that's very satisfying because there's so much to be angry about, and I think it's really important to feel like you can do something tangible.
It's really powerful, that, actually, because there's quite a lot to unpack there, Stephanie, in the right way. And it was really quite interesting. Again, on each level, and with all the examples, you were talking about intention, right? Which is what people wanted to do for the greater good, and also attention. And it was interesting when you were doing the power nap situation where you were slicing off, that's very much where there's focus and attention, isn't it? So this is, to me, that's just a really great example where the two are working either subconsciously or consciously. I mean, probably consciously in your place because you knew what you were doing, but in perfect harmony for the greater good, and potentially, you know, having a huge material benefit. So I think that's sort of really, really helping me think, and really helping the listeners hopefully as well. So before I move on to the next question, I'd like to bring Ben in on that one, because I think it was such a powerful point that you made.
Yeah, and it's one thing which has come up for me about your work, and both you know, community organizing and being a comedian. The pandemic changed a huge amount in many ways, but I'm interested in actually how the pandemic shaped or changed the dynamic or balance between mind and matter. Because for me, it basically reduced a lot of the physicality, the kind of actual you know, embodied experience of the world. We became more you know, stationary and sedentary, and basically just became you know, thought processes on a screen. and so actually this kind of need to kind of, you know, as you point out, to actually kind of be in physical contact, to actually take, you know, take some of these things actually out into the real concrete world is really important. And you alluded to it earlier on, which I thought was really interesting, is that we have all these ideas about consciousness. We don't really, you know, and psychology, there's a replication crisis in psychology. You know, scientists can't replicate their own peers' results because actually, you know, we don't really understand who we are and how our mind works, and so on. And so what I find the paradox is that science for the last couple hundred years has been materialistic. It's been very, very focused on the material world, and technology, if you like, is an application of that science. And I like technology like transport, because it enables me to kind of explore and be in connection with the world. And what we've got with this new technology is almost just reducing our physicality to something which is flat, which is purely cognitive, which is interesting, because it's come from a material understanding. But maybe to your point is that this technology has been built on a misunderstanding about how our minds work. And that actually just kind of sitting down and just being on a screen, isn't how the brain works, because actually our brain's embodied, it's enacted, it's extended out into the real world. And actually, yeah, so there's something here, just trying to understand, you know, how the pandemic changed what you did, both, you know, community organizing and the pandemic, and as a comedian, and just, yeah, what your thoughts are on this technology which we're using, which is great because we wouldn't have connected without it, but actually it's just changing how we function, and it's changing that relationship between mind and matter, I think, profoundly.
Yeah, I think we really need to connect in the meat. I was in lockdown, I was isolating by myself, which was difficult. And I really felt the lack of having a human body in the room with me, because I was alone for 3 months, like completely alone. I really like solitude, so most of the time I was fine, but then I also did go real mad. Like I started getting this weird, so I've had like mental health issues my whole life, but I started getting this weird new symptom where I felt like my hands didn't belong to me, like they were like possessed. I didn't want them touching me, and I used to sit on the sofa like this, like, oh, don't let them get me. And I think that was because my brain as a human couldn't cope with a lack of other humans being just near me. Like I had such a craving sometimes to just be, not even necessarily to have a hug, I'm just like, I want another physical person just to sit in a chair next to me so I can like sense the warmth coming off them. I think we really, really need that. And it was interesting to start the community organizing job, which is so much about relationships. Like it's completely relationship based. You build relationships with each other, you build relationships with power. And to do that job for the first 6, 7, 8 months over Zoom was very weird. I think it wasn't until I started organising in person that I realised how restricting it is to try to build relationships with people over a screen and to motivate ourselves to take real action over a screen as well, because it's connecting with people's humanity that motivates us to do things and to do things together. And yeah, it felt, looking back, I think, a bit cold and clinical and very process based, whereas the first times when we actually met in person, and I met these people who I'd known relatively intimately for about 6 months over a Zoom screen and over phone calls, I was like, firstly, I was very surprised by people's heights. You don't know how tall people are. I was like, you're bigger than I thought you were going to be. You're quite little, aren't you?
I get that a lot.
Yeah. But also it was so much easier to stay motivated and to enjoy what we were doing and to get really passionate when we could just sit next to each other. Yeah, I think we need to be in spaces with each other. Like, that feeling of community is much more difficult to create online.
So that's really interesting, because I'm going to try and bring that back later on, when we start to think a bit about Sweet Spot, but we're not there at the moment. And in fact, it's quite interesting. We've only asked 3 or 4 questions, if that, but we've covered such a lot of ground in those sort of 3 or 4 questions. But I think it wouldn't be fair if we didn't ask you around your core work traditionally, which has been the comedian work, right? And I'm just thinking how this plays out in your comedian work. How would because at one level people could say, oh, it's a very dry philosophical topic, right? Mind and matter. But if you look at some of the recognized comedians at the moment, although in certain circles he's controversial, but Ricky Gervais, for instance, but he actually explores process quite a lot when you actually break it down rather than demographics. That's quite an interesting topic, isn't it? If you think about it, mind and matter, right? And it's causing a lot of deep thought with people. So yeah, I'm beginning to ramble myself a bit now, but in terms of the comedic context, how would you do that? How do you think it relates? Because I think the world does need a lot more humor as well, without being serious. So it feels as though there's potentially a bit of a paradox there, but maybe there isn't, if that makes sense,
Yeah, that's what my TEDx talk was about, actually. It was about the importance of humor in movements for change, so like using comedy to make the world better. Yeah, I'm not so with stand-up, when I do club sets, I'm just quite rude and talk about sex a lot, and it's really funny. And sometimes that can feel a bit pointless, but actually I think humor is really vital for like energizing ourselves and also connecting with people. And then when I do solo shows, I do stuff that's a bit more meaningful. Like, I've talked about experiences from my life. I talked about like domestic abuse and mental health and self-harm, and my brief awful foray into polyamory, which was dreadful, terrible idea. And that feels, it's the connection that I really value in those kinds of shows, where you I love doing shows where people come up to me afterwards and say, thank you so much for talking about that thing. I've never heard somebody talk about that in that way, and it made me feel less alone, or it made me feel comforted. Or I had one woman come up to me once and say, listening to you talk about that has made me feel like maybe I should leave my boyfriend, because we seem to be on that same like slippery slope that you were talking about from my previous relationship. So I think you can really use comedy to make a meaningful connection with an audience. And that's really powerful. And my new show that I'm working on, which is it's a comedy / dance show about bodies. So I'm going to be talking about partly about consent, because, you know, unfortunately it's not surprising. We don't live in a world where it's surprising that bad consent things have happened to me. So like, who owns this body, who gets to have a go on it, that kind of process that I think a lot of, it's probably, I would say it's more common with women, that a process that we go through where you constantly have to reclaim your body from stuff and be like, actually that's mine, stop it, that's mine, please leave that alone, that is mine. So it's a show partly about that, and then also partly about like body image as well, and like why we eat, and whether it's, you know, you can eat to fuel yourself, you can eat to enjoy food, you can not eat because society is telling you that your body is too big and that you shouldn't take up space and that that's unacceptable. And also the feeling that I get from dancing, that like my body is a tool to make cool art rather than something that I have to define based on society's expectations of it, or whether people want to have a go on it, or that kind of stuff. So that show, I think, is a really interesting intersection of like thinking about what the purpose of a body is, and also in terms of, I'm rambling, but I've been thinking about it interestingly. So I have an ADHD diagnosis. I don't have an autism diagnosis, but the people who know and love me, I think if I got an autism diagnosis, they'd be like, yes, that is correct. But the feeling that I get as a almost certainly autistic person, where like, I don't understand what emotion I'm having. I'm like, this is a good one and this is a bad one, and that's as much of a distinction as I'm able to do. So sometimes my boyfriend Paul will be like, are you okay? And I'm like, no. And he's like, what kind of not okay? And I'm like, I'm having one of the bad emotions. But what's really interesting is that you can connect to your emotions using your body. So my therapist has recommended these little cards that they use for kids, actually, that have pictures of bears on them that are experiencing different emotions, and you can see the physicality of the emotion that they're having. And I flicked through them in a session with her recently, and I was like, there's so many, there's like over 40. I didn't know there were so many. But part of what I want to do in the dance show is to like create dance pieces around those little bear cards, so that I can use my body to understand what's happening in my brain, to like dance it out and be like, oh, this is the emotion that happens when I'm feeling this in my head. So like articulate my brain through my body, if you see what I mean.
It was interesting. I heard something recently. It was interesting you talk about emotions and the different emotions and positive and negative emotions. You know, at the end of the day, that is contextual. That has a level of judgment attached to it. And I was listening to another podcast, and they actually said, well, actually, really, what you've got to do is look at it is there's constructive emotions and destructive emotions. When you look at it from an emotional side and a body side, you know, which one's going to help you and which one's not is going to hinder you. And I know in a lot of the coaching work I do on energy leadership, we do cover that quite a bit. But as we move nearer to the end now, because we're sort of running out of time, I'm just thinking, you know, there is a lot of discussion about mindsets at the moment. And, you know, a lot of the corporate work is about, you know, mindsets and behaviors and stuff, which is important and very powerful. And it's great that we're actually looking at. But I'm beginning to wonder now is that, you know, I look at all the strife in the world at all different levels, you know, whether it be political, geopolitical, climate and all the stuff. Is that if we were able to tap in to this understanding of mind and matter in a more not necessarily structured way, but with more clarity, then maybe we'd reduce a lot of the rhetoric, right? Because what we see, and I'm sure you see it, you've seen it, I'm sure you've been exposed to it with misogyny and the other things that you've described, is that it feels like the world would be a better place. You know, maybe it's a sweet spot, maybe it's not, if we could dial down the rhetoric. But then again, it's, you know, attention and intention, you know, what do we have to do to maybe dial down the rhetoric, right? And maybe a better understanding, you know, be clear in our mindsets, be more self-aware and understanding of mind and matter in our particular context, because obviously that's going to vary too, is that might make the world a better place, you know?
Yeah, I think so. I think I feel like there's like a really interesting trend at the moment towards people doing affirmations every morning. I know that my boyfriend does them every day and he finds that really powerful. And I think that's really useful. But I think sometimes sometimes people take those in isolation and it's not enough. Like you see a lot of people online who are incredibly successful. Like Jim Carrey does this a lot. He's like, I just believed that I could do it and then I did. And in reality, he probably worked really hard and was also incredibly lucky. And those are more important than the fact that he told himself that he could.
Yeah.
And so I think it's easy in retrospect to be like, I just believed. But then also I think that really believing stuff does affect the way that your brain works. And it does affect your behavior and your confidence and how you present yourself to people. And that's really powerful as well. Yeah, and I'm quite a cynical person naturally, and my boyfriend is very not cynical. He's very positive and really believes in people and like positivity and the power of, refer to his episode if you want to experience some of that joy. And I feel like he's like draining the cynicism out of me slowly, which is lovely, like kind of like draining a horrible pus-filled spot with his brilliantness. And I do feel like that my life has got better since becoming more positive. Like it's had a massive impact because I feel safer to work harder because I have more like hope about the world.
So it was really interesting because your Jim Carrey example made me smile a lot, because there's plenty of other instances, and it reminds me of one of the authors I follow quite a lot, again, Nassim Taleb, right, who wrote Black Swan, but he's written a series of other books, but one of them called is Fooled by Randomness. And this is where people who are very successful convince themselves that they're successful because of all the activity that they've done, but in reality, when you look at the numbers, they've just been in the right place at the right place at the right time. And I'm certainly not saying that Jim Carrey doesn't have any talent, but I think it's just that in itself I find it's quite humorous. So I think at this point what I'd like to do is, because I think we're at a really, really good point here, is maybe bring Ben in for some closing reflections and some remarks and summaries and stuff, if that's okay, Ben, because I know you've been listening patiently for the last sort of 10 minutes. So.
No, I've been really enjoying it, and we've touched on a huge amount of things. So, you know, in part just because of your diverse journey through life. So thanks for sharing your ideas and thoughts, Stephanie. I think the point on mindsets, which I think about as well, and there is something true about mind over matter, that actually if you kind of there is some power and like kind of logic there, but I think like all things, it gets overextended so like one mindset is everything, but actually, you know, the reality is we're limited in our bodies to some degree. So I think that the kind of useful way I've heard it mentioned is mindset isn't everything, but it influences everything. So it actually has some impact, and that will kind of vary, you know, depending on what it is you're doing and who that person is. But I really like the idea of attention and intention as being kind of a really important bridge, if you like, between our kind of conscious thoughts and awareness and actually, you know, taking action in the physical world. So that for me is quite an important bridge, because it connects us, you know, as just, you know, thinking, feeling beings to actually, you know, physical, biological beings in a social world. And so I think the attention intention is kind of really, really important. I also think that the bit you mentioned about the kind of quantum world and the slit experiments, that actually, you know, you can drill down into smaller and smaller things and be, you know, and actually our awareness, our observing actually changes whether it's a particle or a wave. And it's like, oh, okay, so I really like the idea that, so there's a guy that I follow called Bernardo Kastrup, and he works at the CERN Hadron Collider, and he's a physicist, and so he's you know, he basically deals with small things in the world, small physical things,
small matter.
To matter, yeah, and you know, he kind of now thinks that actually the world is primarily mental, And actually, he uses the analogy of flying a plane and having a cockpit, a dashboard, as like these are the things which we measure physical instruments, whether it's wind speed or temperature, and so matter is almost like this kind of dashboard. But in an effort to kind of, the whole point of Sweet Spot Safari is actually seeing the commonality. And I think that kind of matter and consciousness, or matter and mind, is basically two sides of the same coin. It's part of life and it's part of experience. So yeah, I think that's probably a nice summary and place to leave it.
Brilliant, Ben. So that's an absolutely brilliant place to finish there. And I think we found a sweet spot there, as you say, both sides of the same coin. And as with Ben, I'm now etched on my brain is now the importance of intention and attention, and the sort of how they work in harmony. So I think that's really powerful. So thank you very much, Steph, today. It's been absolutely brilliant, the talk. We've covered a lot of ground. I want to thank you for your humor, your openness, and your vulnerability as well, which is really important, I think, in these discussions that we have. So again, it's been an absolute pleasure. So I'd like to say thank you. And again, guys, look out for our next one, which will be Sweet Spot Safari number 20. We're not quite sure what the topic is on that one yet, but we'll let you know soon. So anyway, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Take care.